The crowd roared like a thunderstorm rolling across the plains. Red hats swayed in unison, fists punched the air, and Donald Trump bellowed into the microphone with the confidence of a man who believed the world bent at his command. Cameras flashed, capturing every exaggerated gesture, every sneer, every promise of dominance. His voice crashed against the arena walls, a wall of sound designed to drown out doubt, dissent, or even truth itself. And yet, just behind him, stood a figure. Still, quiet, silent. No chants echoed from their lips. No expression of wild devotion contorted their face. Instead, their stillness became an uninvited spotlight, a presence that unsettled more than the storm raging at the podium. The silence cut through the chaos, carving out a space so sharp that millions of viewers watching from their screens couldn't take their eyes off it. Who was this? Why were they so quiet? And why did their silence feel louder than Trump's deafening roar? The networks didn't plan for this moment. Trump's team didn't stage it. But America saw it. Social media caught fire with screenshots, side-by-side frames of the former president raging while, behind him, a face remained carved in stone. One was noise. The other, stillness. One demanded loyalty. The other seemed to question everything with nothing but a stare. In politics, words are weapons. Shouts are strategies. But here, silence became the dagger. And though Trump commanded the microphone for the first time in years, he didn't command the room. Gasps rippled across the digital landscape. Twitter threads dissected the silence. TikToks looped the unspoken defiance. News anchors, uncharacteristically speechless, whispered about the strangeness of it all. Silence, it seemed, had stolen the show from the man who prided himself on stealing every headline. It was as though history had paused mid-sentence, waiting for the next word that never came. And, in that pause, something shifted. Something fragile, yet undeniable. Because if Trump's voice was the storm, this silence was the lightning strike no one expected. And what happened next would leave the nation in disbelief. To understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand the stage it challenged. Trump's rallies were not mere political gatherings. They were theater. Every element choreographed, every camera angle considered, every backdrop designed to amplify his image as the center of gravity. Behind him, faces were not random. They were hand-picked props, chosen for their enthusiasm, their willingness to cheer, their eagerness to nod along. The spectacle required loyalty on display, proof of obedience under the spotlight. But on that night, something slipped. One figure broke the script by refusing to play the part. While others clapped until their palms reddened, this presence remained unmoved. While others forced smiles that screamed of desperate allegiance, this one offered only silence. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The stakes weren't just about optics. They were about meaning. Trump had built an empire on the performance of devotion. His authority depended on the illusion that every voice in the room echoed his. That illusion cracked in real time, and millions saw it fracture. What happens when the audience begins to question the play? What happens when the stage itself betrays the star? Progressive America, immigrant families, students, workers who had felt invisible, they watched and felt a jolt of validation. Because that silence carried their feelings, their anger, their exhaustion with the circus of hate. That stillness wasn't apathy. It was resistance. And resistance, especially when unexpected, electrifies the air. The crowd in the arena may not have noticed it immediately, but viewers online did. Screenshots flew across timelines, captions like, "The only sane person in the room," the look that says everything, silent, but louder than Trump. For once, the noise machine faltered, because silence broke through. Trump's strategy was always the same: drown the world in sound, in lies, in relentless bluster. But when someone refuses to echo back, the sound turns hollow. That night, the hollowness echoed louder than any chant of USA, USA. And so the stakes grew. This wasn't a fleeting glance caught on camera. It became a symbol, a rupture, a reminder that not all were willing to nod in unison. Something about it unsettled Trump, unsettled his team, unsettled the carefully maintained illusion. But to truly grasp why the silence mattered, you have to first understand the man it defied. The louder he grew, the weaker his foundation became. And the story of Donald Trump, the antagonist in this unfolding drama, reveals exactly why. Donald Trump had always thrived on noise. From the golden escalator descent that launched his campaign to the relentless rallies that followed, he learned early that attention was power, and noise was the fuel. Every insult hurled at an opponent, every wild claim blasted through a microphone, every stunt meant to shock the media was part of the same strategy: dominate the narrative through sheer volume. His history was littered with moments of arrogance that played like theater. He mocked the disabled, belittled immigrants, sneered at women, and dismissed critics with schoolyard taunts. Each time, the headlines rolled in, and Trump fed off the outrage like oxygen. To him, silence was death. Better to be hated loudly than ignored quietly. His supporters saw strength where others saw cruelty. They mistook chaos for authenticity, mistook bullying for courage. He cultivated their loyalty by amplifying division, convincing them that his roar was the only voice worth hearing. He did not lead, he drowned. He did not inspire, he suffocated. Behind the scenes, the contradictions piled high. He preached about law and order while lawsuits dogged his businesses. He mocked weakness while hiding insecurity. He promised prosperity while bankruptcies lined his record. And yet, through it all, he mastered one dark art, making sure the camera was always on him. Trump's dominance relied on one condition: that everyone around him played their part. That they laughed at his jokes, nodded at his lies, clapped at his bravado. Loyalty was a performance, and he demanded encores every night. To betray the performance was to commit the gravest sin in Trump's orbit. And that is why the silence behind him was so dangerous. Because it shattered the illusion. For a man obsessed with optics, obsessed with image, obsessed with dominance, the quiet defiance of one figure was like a crack in the mirror, a crack that risked shattering everything. This was the villain of our story, not just loud, but addicted to loudness. Not just arrogant, but dependent on arrogance. A man who feared one thing above all: being ignored. And on that night, the silence standing behind him proved more powerful than all his noise. But to understand the true weight of that silence, you must first know the one who carried it, the figure who stood still as Trump raged. They weren't meant to be a symbol. They hadn't asked for the role. But sometimes history chooses its heroes in the quietest of ways. The person behind Trump came from a world far different from the blinding lights of political rallies. Their life was built not on spectacle, but on survival, on sacrifice, on resilience. Born into an immigrant household, they grew up balancing identities, learning early the power of restraint. Their parents worked long hours, carrying the weight of dreams on tired shoulders, teaching through action that dignity is not noise, it's endurance. The child learned to listen more than speak, to observe more than to boast. In silence, they discovered strength. School was not always kind. Names were mispronounced, cultures misunderstood, the sting of exclusion constant. But the quiet resilience built a foundation no insult could shake. They knew what it meant to be underestimated, dismissed, silenced by others. And that made their own silence more deliberate, more powerful. As they grew, service became their compass. They volunteered, they studied, they worked. Not for applause, but for the quiet pride of contribution. Where Trump demanded attention, they sought meaning. Where he needed validation, they found purpose in humility. And so, when they found themselves placed on that stage behind Trump, it was no accident of destiny. It was the culmination of every moment of quiet endurance, every lesson in restraint, every struggle survived. They did not shout because they did not need to. They did not clap because they would not betray themselves. Their silence carried the weight of generations who had been told to stay quiet, and turned that silence into defiance. The cameras caught more than a face. They caught a lifetime of dignity condensed into one still frame. Trump raged. The crowd howled. But behind him stood the embodiment of a different kind of power. One that didn't need microphones. One that didn't need spectacle. Because sometimes, the loudest message is the one left unsaid. And as the rally reached its fever pitch, the contrast between noise and silence reached breaking point. The stage was set for escalation, a clash not of words, but of presence. The energy in the arena swelled like a storm. Trump leaned harder into his lines, feeding off the crowd's frenzy. Insults flew like sparks, promises inflated beyond belief. Each word was meant to crush dissent, to remind every listener that his was the only voice that mattered. But behind him, the figure did not move. Arms crossed, lips sealed, eyes steady. The cameras noticed. They cut to the face more often, lingering, searching. The audience watching at home began to notice too. The contrast was undeniable, a wall of sound in the foreground, a wall of silence in the background. Trump sneered at opponents, mocked journalists, unleashed yet another round of exaggerations. The silence, however, became the unspoken response to each line. Every time he raised his voice, the lack of echo cut sharper. Every time the crowd cheered, the stillness mocked the performance. Tension rose. It was no longer just Trump and his supporters. It was Trump versus the absence of applause. Trump versus the refusal to nod. Trump versus silence itself. Social media caught fire again. Clips flooded timelines. Look at the one behind him. Notice the silence. This is the real opposition. People began narrating the silence as though it were dialogue, filling in what they imagined the figure was thinking. I don't believe a word of this. This is embarrassing. Not in my name. And in many ways, the silence spoke those truths more effectively than any words could have. Trump grew louder. He gestured more wildly. His face flushed red with a strain of dominance. But the harder he tried to command the stage, the clearer it became that he was no longer the center of attention. The silence had stolen the spotlight. And then, with one piercing glance at the camera, the figure sealed the moment. A look that said it all.
Calm. Steady.
Defiant. The crowd kept chanting. Trump kept shouting. But the balance had shifted. Because in that instant, the silence delivered the loudest blow, and what followed would bring the rally crashing into something Trump never expected, a cultural mic drop that no soundbite could erase. Trump was a master of escalation, but he had never faced a counterattack like this. Not from an opponent on a debate stage. Not from a journalist pressing him with facts. This one came from behind him, from the very spot meant to prove loyalty. And it came not with words, but with silence. As Trump pressed harder, his voice turning almost desperate in its volume, the cameras betrayed him. Every time the broadcast director cut to the silent figure, millions of viewers shifted their focus. No matter what he said, no matter how he roared, people saw the same thing, the quiet refusal to play along. It was a mic drop without a microphone, and it landed with devastating force. On Twitter, threads exploded. One viral post read, "Trump is screaming, but all I see is the silence behind him. And it's glorious." Another meme captured the still face with a caption, "The resistance is televised." Overnight, the silence became a character in the national drama. Trump tried jokes. He mocked, he gestured, he pounded the podium. But the more he raged, the more the silence eclipsed him. Viewers began to notice the subtle shifts, the twitch of his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes, the way he tried too hard to draw the cameras back to himself. For a man addicted to dominance, this was a nightmare. The loss of control. The power of silence grew as the night wore on. Reporters in the press box scribbled furiously. The rally was about Trump, but the story was about the one behind him. Cable news hosts replayed the clips, emphasizing the contrast. Commentators marveled at how a single unmoving face outshone the loudest man in politics. And then came the cultural mic drop. Late-night hosts built monologues around it. Memes multiplied. TikToks layered music over the silence, turning it into satire, into protest, into art. Trump's counterattacks fell flat. He could not outshout silence. He could not mock it away. For once, the theater was not his alone. And the more people shared, the clearer it became, this was not a moment of passivity. It was an act of resistance, the refusal to perform loyalty, the rejection of noise. For all his bluster, Trump had been undone not by a rival speech, not by a scathing article, but by a silent stare. And the shockwaves had only just. In the end, silent behind Trump was not just a meme, not just a viral moment. It was a story about power, the power of restraint, the power of presence, the power of refusing to bow. Trump's roar filled the room, but it was silence that filled the nation. And that silence belongs to all of us. To every immigrant family told to stay quiet. To every worker told to nod along. To every student told their voice doesn't matter. The silence behind Trump spoke for millions. So the question now is simple. What will you do with your voice, your presence, your silence? Because in the battle between dignity and arrogance, every choice counts. Share this story. Carry it forward. And remember, even in the age of endless shouting, silence can shake the world.